Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm excited to have the chance to interview the three laureates of the Wolf Prize for 2021. Professor Joan Steitz from Yale University, Professor Lynne Maquat from the University of Rochester, and Professor Adrian Krainer from Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory. All made groundbreaking discoveries in the RNA world, a world that was not known until recently, and was known years ago by biochemists and molecular biologists. The COVID RNA vaccine made the RNA field very famous. The RNA now is viewed as a magic bullet.